A black woman drives down a quiet street on a late afternoon, the sun setting low, casting long shadows. Across the road, her hands grip the steering wheel as the car hums steadily along the asphalt. In the rearview mirror, a police car appears, flashing lights suddenly lighting up the rearview mirror. She doesn't panic, she's seen this before, but something feels different about today. Something in the officer's body language feels off. He doesn't immediately signal for her to pull over. Instead, he follows her for what seems like an eternity, the tension building with every passing second. She knows the feeling, the weight of being a black woman pulled over by a cop. There's a unique sense of discomfort that comes with it, the silent calculation of whether today will be the day something goes wrong. She takes a deep breath and pulls to the side of the road. The officer follows her closely and parks behind her, his headlights shining bright in the rearview mirror. The weight of his presence feels almost suffocating. She watches the officer's silhouette approach the car. He moves quickly, not casual or relaxed, but purposeful. His hand rests near his gun on his belt, as if ready for something. She rolls down the window slowly, a slight breeze carrying the sound of distant traffic. The officer's face remains hard, his eyes scanning her, as if searching for something she hasn't done yet. The smell of his cologne fills the air as he leans toward the car and asks for her license and registration. His voice is steady, but there's an edge to it, almost like a challenge. She hands over the documents without a word. Her heart begins to race, but she keeps her hands visible on the steering wheel, trying to remain calm. The officer takes the papers without saying another word and walks back to his car. She watches him in the side mirror. He speaks into his radio, his voice sharp. She can't hear the words, but she knows he's running her information. She waits in the quiet. The minutes feel like hours. Her mind races through all the scenarios that could unfold, the uncertainty swirling in her chest. Her thoughts are interrupted when the officer suddenly returns to her window. His demeanor is different now, his brow furrowed, his jaw clenched. He doesn't hand back her documents or give her a polite warning. He instead asks her to step out of the vehicle. His tone is commanding, firm. There's no explanation, no reason given, just an order. She freezes for a moment, caught off guard. She wasn't prepared for this. There's no reason why she should be getting out of her car. She's done nothing wrong, but the officer's presence feels overpowering. She feels the weight of the situation closing in on her. She glances around the empty street, no witnesses, no one to intervene. She hesitates just for a second, unsure if she should comply or challenge his authority. But then she makes a decision. She opens the door, slowly steps out of the car, and faces the officer's cold gaze. There's something about the way he looks at her, as if he's already made up his mind about who she is before she's even spoken a word. The officer's eyes never leave her as he orders her to stand by the vehicle, his voice sharp and demanding. She complies without a word. She stands tall, her posture straight, trying to maintain control, but inside her mind is racing. She feels the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. The officer begins circling her car, walking slowly, as if inspecting every inch of it, his eyes scanning for something he can use against her, as if she's already guilty of something she hasn't done. He stops in front of her and looks her up and down, his gaze lingering on her face, as if searching for some sign of defiance or resistance. He tilts his head slightly as he speaks, his words like a challenge. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken judgment. She doesn't respond. Instead, she takes a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. She knows better than to react in anger, even though every part of her wants to scream out at him, to demand an explanation. She knows how this goes, how quickly things can escalate, how dangerous it can be for someone like her, a black woman. In this moment, she swallows her frustration and looks the officer in the eye. She remains silent but firm in her resolve. He continues his questioning, but his tone becomes more aggressive with each passing second. He accuses her of being uncooperative, of giving him attitude, of not following his orders. The words sting even though she knows they are false. She's done nothing wrong, and yet he treats her like a criminal. His accusations don't make sense, but he keeps talking over her like she doesn't even have the right to speak. She stands there listening to him. She feels the heat rising in her chest, but she refuses to give him the satisfaction of seeing her angry. The officer steps closer to her, now his presence looming over her, as he demands that she step towards the patrol car. She glances around at the empty street, wondering if anyone will notice, if anyone will stop to see what's really happening here. But there's no one there, no one to witness the injustice unfolding in front of her. She knows this is a game to him, a test of her patience, a way to assert dominance over her. She hesitates just for a second, trying to read his intentions, wondering if she can still de-escalate the situation with words, but he cuts her off. Before she has the chance to speak, he grabs her arm too, roughly pulling her toward the car And in that moment, something inside her snaps, a mix of fear and anger rising to the surface. She doesn't say a word, but she resists the force of his grip, pulling back just enough to regain some control. She refuses to let him drag her through this. She won't give him that power. She stands her ground, even as he mutters about resisting arrest. The officer seems confused by her calm demeanor. He expected her to panic. He expected her to break under the pressure, but she doesn't. She stays composed, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind clear as ever. The officer's grip tightens on her arm as he pulls her toward the patrol car. She can feel the roughness in his touch, and it sends a chill through her. She refuses to be dragged. She refuses to be treated like a criminal. She pulls back again, this time more forcefully, and for the first time she speaks, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not resisting. You don't have a reason to arrest me." The officer stops for a moment, looking at her as if he didn't expect her to respond this way. His brow furrows, and there's a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He doesn't know how to react. She's not scared. She's not intimidated. She's standing tall and facing him without flinching. He takes a step back, trying to reassert his authority, but she doesn't budge. She holds his gaze steady, and unyielding. The seconds stretch on in a tense silence as he looks her over, as if trying to decide whether to back down or escalate the situation further. Her mind races. She knows that she can't let this go on for much longer. She knows how quickly things can go wrong. When power is abused, she takes a deep breath and speaks again. "I haven't done anything wrong, and you know it. You can't just arrest people for no reason." His face tightens, his jaw clenched in frustration. The silence is thick with tension, and then suddenly his tone shifts from accusation to command. "Get in the car now." He barks at her. She doesn't respond immediately. Instead, she stands still, her eyes locked on his. The calmness in her voice betrays the storm of emotions inside. She doesn't want to get in that car. She doesn't want to give in to his authority, not when she knows it's unjust. But she also knows that if she refuses, it could escalate into something worse. The last thing she wants is to end up on the ground with him on top of her, using force to subdue her. She swallows hard and glances at the patrol car, then back at him. She knows this is the moment where everything changes. And in that instant, she makes a decision. She opens the door of the patrol car herself and sits down without a word. There's no defiance, no anger, just the cold realization that she has to comply for her own safety. The officer watches her for a moment, as if surprised that she isn't putting up more of a fight, and for a brief second, she wonders if he's second-guessing his own actions. But it's too late to take it back. He slams the door shut and walks around to the front of the car, speaking into his radio, his voice sharp and demanding. The woman sits in silence, her hands folded in her lap. She feels a pang of frustration, but also a sense of determination. She's not just a victim here. She won't let herself be one. The officer returns to his vehicle, and she watches him as he takes a seat behind the wheel. He glances at her again, but this time there's a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, as if he realizes the gravity of what he's just done. She doesn't let him see her fear or doubt. She remains composed and unmoving, knowing that whatever happens next, she'll face it head-on with strength and clarity. The officer sits in his patrol car, for a moment his hand resting on the steering wheel, his eyes flicking back and forth between the woman in the back seat and the radio in front of him. He mutters something under his breath, his fingers twitching as if unsure what to do next. He knows he's crossed a line, but he's too deep in to back out now. He's already made the call, and it's only a matter of time before backup arrives and the situation escalates further. The woman remains silent, her mind racing, but outwardly she's the picture of calm, her hands still folded in her lap, her gaze focused straight ahead. She knows that if she shows fear or frustration, now it could give him the power he's been seeking all along. Instead, she chooses to stay composed, to remind herself that she has the control here. She knows she's in the right. She hasn't done anything wrong. It's the officer who's overstepping his bounds. The car sits in stillness, except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. The minutes feel like hours, each one ticking by in excruciating silence. She wonders how long it will take before someone notices that she's missing, or if anyone even cares. It's a strange feeling to be this alone in the middle of an injustice, and yet not a single person is around to witness it. She tries not to let her thoughts spiral. She doesn't have the luxury of being lost in worry or doubt, not when she's being treated this way. Her mind flashes to the countless times she's heard about others who've been wronged by the system and ended up with worse outcomes. She can't let that be her. She won't let it happen. She takes another deep breath, steadying herself as the officer begins to speak again. His voice is more controlled now, less sure of himself. "You're not being arrested. Yet he says the words hang in the air for a moment like a twisted consolation prize. She wants to laugh, but she keeps her face neutral because she knows better than to react. He's still looking for a reason to escalate this, still trying to justify his actions. As he glances at her through the rearview mirror, she holds his gaze for a moment, daring him to say something that could trigger another confrontation, but the moment passes quickly, and he turns his attention back to the radio. The silence returns, and with it the weight of everything she's about to face in the coming days. What started as a simple traffic stop is quickly spiraling into something much bigger. She doesn't know exactly what's going to happen, but she's prepared for the worst. She won't back down, and she won't let the officer's actions define her. Her hands grip the seat just a little tighter as she braces herself for what's coming next. The door to the unknown opening wider with every passing second. She's a black woman in America, and this moment is about to become a turning point in a much larger story, one that will reach far beyond this quiet street and affect countless others who have faced the same injustice she has. The officer's voice crackles over the radio again, and the static fills the car for a moment as he calls for backup, his hand tightening on the mic as if he's trying to keep his nerves in check. The woman watches him carefully, trying to read his every move, the tension between them growing thicker. By the second, she can feel the heat of his gaze on her. Even though he doesn't speak, he's waiting for something, maybe for her to crack, maybe for her to fight back, or maybe for the backup to arrive and give him the justification he needs to escalate things further. The silence grows heavy in the car, and the woman remains still, her thoughts focused on the situation at hand. She knows this could end in many different ways. She knows the stories she's heard, the things that have happened to people like her when they've been treated this way. But she also knows that she has a voice, and she has the power to fight back. She won't let him silence her. She won't let him break her. The minutes crawl by, and she can't help but wonder if anyone's even noticed that she's missing, or if anyone's trying to find out what's happening to her. She doesn't have her phone, no way of reaching out, no one to call for help, and the thought of being entirely alone in this moment makes her stomach tighten. But she refuses to let fear take over. Instead, she channels that fear into something stronger, a steady resolve that refuses to be shaken by this man's power over her. She glances at him again through the rearview mirror. He's still watching her, but this time there's something different in his expression. It's almost as if he's beginning to doubt himself, or maybe he's realizing that he's in over his head. He seems hesitant, unsure of what to do next. The backup still hasn't arrived, and the radio falls silent for a brief moment. It's almost as if the whole world has paused to hold its breath. She knows this is her moment. She knows that if she can keep calm, if she can keep steady, she has a chance to turn this situation around. She refuses to let him control the narrative. She refuses to let him paint her as the one in the wrong. The car door opens suddenly, and she's startled as a second officer approaches the patrol car, his presence making the air around her feel even heavier. He steps closer to the window, his eyes scanning her face with a curious intensity. For a brief moment, there's a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe it's recognition, maybe it's doubt, but whatever it is, it's gone. As quickly as it came, he turns to speak to the first officer, and she can't hear their conversation, but the tension is palpable. She watches their body language, closely trying to understand what's happening, what they're planning. But it's all happening too fast. She can see the first officer's hands trembling just slightly as he hands over the paperwork to his partner. The second officer looks at the papers and then at her, and for the first time in what feels like forever, the woman allows herself to exhale just a little, not enough to relax, but enough to let her guard down. For a second, her mind racing with possibilities. She knows the worst isn't over, but for the first time in what feels like hours, she sees a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this moment could turn in her favor. The second officer takes the paperwork without saying a word, his eyes flicking back and forth between the woman and the first officer, his gaze cold and calculating. He doesn't seem concerned, but there's something about the way he holds the papers that makes her wonder if he's seen something in the files that changes the situation. She watches closely, hoping to catch a glimpse of what's happening behind the scenes. The first officer is still standing by the car, his hand gripping the side of the door tightly as if bracing himself for what comes next. His body language betrays his uncertainty. She can feel it in the air. There's something wrong, something he's not saying. The woman stays silent, watching them, both her mind racing with every possibility. She knows this moment could go either way. She's aware of the risk, but she refuses to let herself show fear. She's not going to let them win, not like this. The seconds drag on as the two officers continue to talk quietly to each other. The first officer gestures toward her briefly, but the second officer just nods and looks back at the papers, still not saying a word. The woman's heart races in her chest. She knows she has to act quickly if she's going to turn this around. She can't wait forever. She won't let herself be trapped in this situation. The seconds feel like they stretch into eternity, and she feels her patience wearing thin. Her mind flashes back to the moment she was first pulled over, to the coldness in the officer's voice, to the way he treated her, as if she were already guilty of something she hadn't done, to the way his actions felt more like an interrogation than a simple traffic stop. She shakes her head slightly as if to clear the thoughts away. She needs to focus on the now. She can't change what's happened so far, but she can control what happens next. The second officer finishes reading the papers and turns toward the first officer. There's a shift in their demeanor. Now it's subtle, but it's there. The first officer looks at the second officer nervously, as if waiting for a signal, but the second officer doesn't give him one. Instead, he looks at the woman, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since arriving on the scene. His gaze is different now. It's less stern, less accusatory, and for a brief moment, she wonders if he's finally starting to understand the situation. He glances at the first officer again, this time with a look that seems to say enough. The first officer hesitates, then nods reluctantly, his face still flushed with frustration. He turns toward the woman, and for the first time he speaks to her, without the edge in his voice. "You're free to go." He says the words come out flat, like he's just going through the motions. She doesn't react at first, not sure if she's hearing him right, if she's somehow misinterpreting the situation. But the second officer nods again and steps back a little. She exhales slowly, and then without a word she opens the door of the patrol car and steps out onto the pavement. Her legs feel shaky, but she stands firm, not allowing herself to show weakness. She doesn't look back at the officers. As she walks away, her mind already on what she has to do next. She knows the fight isn't over, not by a long shot, but for now she's walking away from this moment with her dignity intact and a story that she will make sure is heard by the world.
The woman walks away from the patrol car, her steps steady, but her mind racing. She knows the fight she's just been through is only the beginning. But for now she's free. The officers don't call after her, they don't stop her, they don't try to change her mind. She keeps her eyes forward. As she moves down the street, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, the city around her feels quiet now, as if holding its breath, waiting to see what comes next. But she knows that her story isn't just her own, it's the story of so many others who have faced the same treatment, who have been treated as less than human by the very people who are supposed to protect them. She takes out her phone and dials a number. It rings twice before someone answers. It's a friend who's been checking in on her all day. "Are you okay?" the voice asks. And she can hear the concern. She doesn't answer right away. Instead, she takes a deep breath and looks up at the sky, the setting sun casting long shadows across the city streets. "I'm fine," she says, but her voice trembles slightly. And she hates that it does. She wants to be strong. She wants to sound unshaken. But she knows the truth deep down. She's still processing everything that just happened. She's still trying to make sense of the anger, the fear, the helplessness she felt in that moment when she was pulled from her car, when her body was forced into submission for no reason other than the color of her skin. But now she knows something else too. She knows that she has a voice. She knows that this moment won't be forgotten, and it will be the fuel she needs to push forward and speak out about the injustices that happen every day. But she also knows that the battle ahead will be long, and it will be difficult, and it will be full of people who try to silence her, who try to paint her as an outlier, as someone who is just overreacting. But she won't let them. She won't let them take her voice away. She won't let them twist this into something that doesn't reflect the truth. She hangs up the phone and takes another deep breath. The street is still empty around her, and for a moment she lets herself feel the weight of everything that's just happened. She's not sure what comes next, but she knows she can't let this go. She can't let this moment pass without speaking up, without telling the world what happened. She starts walking again, this time with more purpose, her steps more determined than before. She knows that she has to use this moment to make a change, to shed light on the system that continues to abuse its power and hurt people like her, people who are simply living their lives, but are treated as criminals for no reason at all. The sun is almost gone now, and the city is starting to come alive in a different way. The lights flicker on in the windows of nearby buildings, and the streets begin to fill with people going about their evening routine. But she's not just another face in the crowd, she's someone who's been wronged, and she's determined to make sure it's known. The woman arrives at her home, her keys in her hand, but she doesn't immediately go inside. She stands at the door, for a moment staring at the lock. She can feel the weight of everything she's just experienced pressing down on her shoulders. The adrenaline that had kept her moving is starting to fade, and in its place is a heavy exhaustion. But she refuses to let herself crumble. Not now, not when she knows she has work to do. She takes another deep breath and opens the door. Stepping inside, she closes it behind her and leans against it for a moment, letting out a long sigh. Her mind is still racing with thoughts of everything that happened on the street. The officer's cold demeanor, the fear she felt, the strange mix of anger and helplessness, the uncertainty of what would happen next. But she won't let that moment define her. She won't let it take her down. She knows what's at stake now, and she's more determined than ever to use her position to fight back. She walks into her living room and sits down on the couch, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for some kind of answer in the quiet space. But there's no answer waiting for her. It's up to her to find it. She pulls out her phone again and begins to type a message, but she stops halfway through and puts the phone down. Instead, she needs to gather her thoughts first. She knows that what she says next will matter more than anything else she's done so far. It will shape the conversation. It will determine how the world sees what happened to her. She picks up the phone again and starts typing a message, but this time it's different. This time, it's not just a message to a friend or family member. It's a statement. It's her voice, her truth, and she's going to make sure everyone hears it. She writes about the incident, the way she was pulled over for no reason, the way she was treated with suspicion and disdain, the way the officer tried to intimidate her with his words and his actions. She writes about the fear she felt and the anger that came with it. But she also writes about the strength she found in that moment, the calmness that allowed her to stand her ground even when everything around her seemed to be spiraling out of control. She writes about the power of staying true to herself and not letting anyone else define who she is. She writes because she knows this isn't just about her, it's about everyone who has been treated this way and hasn't had the opportunity to speak up. It's about shining a light on the injustice that happens every day in the streets and the way people of color are often seen as suspects before they're seen as people. She finishes typing and takes a moment to read it over. She knows it's just the beginning, but it's a start. She presses send and watches as the message disappears into the digital world, knowing that it will reach people who need to hear it, people who will understand what she's going through, and maybe even people who will join her in the fight for justice. She sits back and exhales, the weight of the world still on her shoulders, but a little bit lighter now. She knows this is only the first step, but she's ready for what comes next.